What is a frame story or a frame narrative? That's this week's topic in World Literature 1. A frame story or a frame narrative is an overarching story that either sets the stage for another main story or serves as the unifying force for a collection of shorter stories. In works where there is a single story, the frame story helps set the reader's attitude for the main story. If you've ever read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, then you will have experienced this. The book begins with a tale of a ship captain bound for the North Pole who pulls Dr. Victor Frankenstein, the creator of the monster, out of the frigid Arctic Ocean. Movie examples of this kind of frame story include The Wizard of Oz, The Princess Bride, and maybe even Inception. The other kind of frame story, the container variety, is an older form. Some examples include The Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor from ancient Egypt, The Odyssey from ancient Greece, and Boccaccio's Heptameron from medieval Italy. In each collection, there is a story that gives a reason for the other stories. Our readings for this week are these kinds of container stories: 1001 Nights, Canterbury Tales, and the Heptameron. In 1001 Nights, Shahrazad, the new wife of a tyrannical king, Shahriyar, bent on killing his wives the day he marries them, uses stories as a ploy to keep herself alive long enough for the king to change his mind about women. Shahriyar grows so fond of Shahrazad and her stories that he decides to keep her alive. It also helps that she's had 3 sons by the end of 1001 Nights. I'll talk more about the frame stories of the other works in those sections. Let's delve a little deeper into 1001 Nights. 1001 Nights has a complex and ambiguous genesis and authorship, one that goes back all the way to the 9th century CE. This version was contained in a Syrian paper discovered in 1948 by a scholar working in the Cairo archive. It seems like the collection of tales was in reasonably wide circulation in the Islamic world, as Baghdadi and Persian versions are mentioned, as early as the 10th century. Your anthology puts forth the idea that these stories may have sprung from a Sanskrit original. You'll recall that the Ramayana was written in Sanskrit. The frame story structure allows this work to be extremely fluid, as new stories can always be added to the list as Shahrazad adds nights to her life. The scholar Paula Limas Horta postulates that there were 2 centers of distribution for 1001 Nights: an eastern center based in Cairo and Damascus, and a western one based in Maghreb, a region of northwest Africa. It was the tales from the Maghreb that entered into European consciousness, traveling through Muslim Spain and thence to Italy, where they influenced Boccaccio, another writer of frame stories, whom we will not have time to meet thoroughly, although I'll mention him in the Chaucer Canterbury Tales section. There are 7 extant or still existing and largely complete copies of 1001 Nights from the Middle Ages, located in various places. The earliest one dates from around 1190 CE. There are about 20 stories in common among these 7 old copies, and there is no scholarly agreement on which of the 7 versions is the most authentic. In the 1600s, an unnamed Egyptian author compiled 1001 Nights from the various stories, Arabian, Persian, and Indian, which he related in colloquial Arabic. Frenchman Antoine Galland began to translate it in 1704, and versions in other European languages soon followed, including one in 1706 in English. This collection featured some of the more famous tales that we think of today: the tales of Sinbad the Sailor, of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and of course Aladdin, although the story of Aladdin may actually have had its roots in China. So that is how the West first encountered 1001 Arabian Nights as a collected work. You will see in the selection for this week's reading the beautiful young daughter of the vizier, Shahrazad, offers herself up as the tyrannical king Shahriyar's next bride. Shahriyar's former wife had been supremely unfaithful, and he has decided to get his revenge upon womankind by marrying a new wife each night and killing her in the morning. Shahrazad keeps herself alive by spinning stories. Think about the overall frame story purpose as you interpret the tale of the merchant and the demon. Also think about how the disadvantaged sex, females, are able to stay alive and prosper under this terrible situation. Many much more learned scholars than I can tell you that 1001 Nights makes various comments on Islam and cannot be separated entirely from the Muslim faith, though of course it is a collection of stories and not holy scriptures. I'd like to read you a very short story called The Donkey from 1001 Nights. Think about what the story is saying about faith and reason as I read it. You can find the link to the text of the story in the lecture notes transcript. Here we go. The Donkey. It is related that a pair of tricksters once saw a simpleton leading a donkey by its halter along a deserted road. "I will steal that beast," said one of them to his companion, "and make an ass of its master. Follow me, and you shall see." He went up behind the simpleton without a sound, and, deftly loosing the halter from the donkey, placed it round his own neck. He then jogged along as though nothing had happened. When his friend had safely made off with the beast, the thief abruptly halted and would not yield to the repeated jerks of the rope. Looking over his shoulder, the simpleton was utterly confounded to see his donkey transformed into a human being. "Who in heaven's name are you?" he cried. "Sir," replied the thief, "I am your donkey, but my story is marvelously strange. It all happened one day when I returned home, very drunk, as was my custom. My pious old mother received me with an indignant rebuke and pleaded with me against my evil ways. But I took up my staff and beat her, whereupon she invoked Allah's vengeance, and I was instantly transformed into the donkey which has faithfully served you all these years. Today the old woman must have taken pity on me and prayed to Allah to change me back into human shape." "There is no strength or help save in Allah," cried the simpleton. "I beg you to pardon the treatment you have received at my hands and all the hardships you have endured in my service." He set the robber free and returned home in a pitiful state of bewilderment and dejection. "What has happened to you, and where is your donkey?" asked his wife. When he related to her the strange story, the woman began to wring her hands, crying, "The wrath of Allah will be upon us for having used a human being so brutally." And she fell down penitently on her knees, reciting verses from the Quran. For several days afterwards, the simpleton stayed idle at home. At length his wife counseled him to go and buy another donkey, in order that he might resume his work. So off he went to the marketplace, and as he was inspecting the animals put up for sale, he was astounded to see his own donkey amongst them. Having identified the beast beyond all doubt, the simpleton whispered in its ear, "The devil take you for an incorrigible wretch! Have you been drinking and beating your old mother again? By Allah, I will not buy you a second time." Who comes out ahead in this story? The simpleton and his wife, or the tricksters? Is the story arguing that faith must be combined with reason? What do you think the message is here? We'll now move on to the most influential work of medieval English literature, the Canterbury Tales, a work by a single known author, Geoffrey Chaucer, and with a specific date. Your textbook gives you a pretty good introduction to Chaucer the man. Even though he lived over 200 years before England's most famous writer, William Shakespeare, we actually know a lot more about Chaucer's everyday life than we do about William Shakespeare's. Why is this? Well, Chaucer, along with being a writer, was a government official, and England has long been very good at bureaucracy. To sum up Chaucer's life as briefly as possible, he came from an affluent mercantile family. His father was a wine merchant, and he entered public service at a young age. Chaucer traveled widely around Europe for his job, and his writing was profoundly influenced by the time he spent in Italy. The 14th century marked the beginning of the Renaissance in Italy, with Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy, and whom we'll encounter next week, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, whose main work was the Decameron. I'll stop here to say a little bit about the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, as it is a work most closely tied to the Canterbury Tales. Like Chaucer's most well-known work, the Decameron is a collection of stories built around a frame. 10 friends, 7 young women, and 3 young men, all of high status, flee Florence to a nearby villa to escape the Black Death. They were sheltering in place from a pandemic at the equivalent of someone's fancy lake house. Each day, someone was in charge of setting a theme for the day, like love stories with happy endings, love stories with sad endings, tricks that women play on men, the power of human will, etc. And each of the characters must present a story based around that theme. All told, there are 10 nights of storytelling, meaning the Decameron contains, in my awesome math skills I can tell you this, 100 stories. Some of these stories went on to influence later writers who adapted the tales for their own. Some very notable authors, including Shakespeare himself, mined the Decameron for source material, including Lope de Vega, the Spanish Shakespeare, Molière, who you could call the French Shakespeare, the reformer Martin Luther, the poets John Keats, Longfellow, and Tennyson, and artists like Botticelli and Rubens have also been drawn to the Decameron for inspiration. Boccaccio, in turn, drew on other works when collecting his stories, so he repaid the favor. Back to Chaucer. The Canterbury Tales was probably written between 1387 and 1400 CE and was Chaucer's last work in his lifetime. It is unfinished. Like the Decameron, Canterbury Tales is a collection of stories. Unlike Boccaccio, Chaucer has narrators of varying social classes. This wide deviation gives the reader a variety of kinds of stories, including moral tales, which are known as exempla, fables, saints' lives, romances, epics, and fabliaux, which are racy tales featuring lower or middle-class characters and usually involving some sort of trickery. The framed story in Canterbury Tales is not sheltering in place from a pandemic, but a religious pilgrimage to Thomas Becket's shrine at Canterbury Cathedral. The pilgrims stop at an inn where the host, Harry Bailey, encourages them to have a storytelling contest. Each character tells a story that would suit his social station, and Chaucer draws inspiration for these tales from both folk tales and from literary sources like the Romance of the Rose, as well as from theological works. One of the things I'd like to touch very briefly on is Chaucer's influence on English prosody, or the pattern of rhythm and sound in poetry. Along with Shakespeare, Chaucer is typically considered to be a father of English literature. Chaucer was the first to widely use iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is a pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in poetry that we'll discuss in more detail when we study Hamlet. Suffice it to say that most English poetry is written with iambic pentameter, including most of Shakespeare's poetry. Chaucer was also the first to use the rhyme royal rhyme scheme. We'll talk more about the formal features of poetry in World Lit II. For those who remember scanning poems for rhyme scheme in the past, the rhyme royal uses this pattern, ABA, BB, CC. Chaucer uses the rhyme royal for works including Troilus and Cresside and parts of the Canterbury Tales. We'll now talk a little bit about the wife of Bath as a character and about what her prologue reveals regarding medieval society, and especially marriage. But I want to first mention Bath itself, a town in southwestern England famous for its Roman ruins and natural hot springs. During the Middle Ages, it became wealthy due to the wool and cloth trade. I did not assign the full general prologue or any of the Wife of Bath's prologue for this week, so I'll give you a summary here. In the introductions, we learn that the Wife of Bath, whom we find out later is named Alison, has been married 5 times. She is described as a wealthy and beautiful woman of around 40 years old, who enjoys dressing finely and who wears red stockings. She has traveled widely, going to Jerusalem 3 times, as well as Rome and various places in modern-day France and Spain. She is also a skilled and prosperous weaver with international renown. Chaucer paints us the picture of a woman very much in command of herself, who demands respect. Another thing to note is that women, while very restrained by societal conventions, could indeed go on pilgrimages in Europe at this time without their husbands. In both her business and her love of pilgrimages, the wife of Bath pushes the boundaries of independent living. That she is able to achieve her independence partly through taking advantage of rich older husbands is a consideration here, of course. In the prologue, the wife of Bath will also speak quite frankly about gender relations within marriage. Of the 5 husbands she's had, 3 of them were older and 2 were younger than she. Allison prefers the older husbands because she can rule them more easily. Taming the younger husbands, including Jankin, her current husband, who is half her age, is a lot more difficult. The wife of Bath is left partially deaf after a domestic violence incident with Jankin before she is able to tame him fully. Although Allison has trouble with her husbands, there is no mention of her leaving them. This was a time when divorce had a very different meaning than it does now. A divorce in England in the Middle Ages, and for quite a few centuries beyond, meant more like either a legal separation or an annulment. There was no alimony and no child support. Of course, Allison seems quite proud that she has been able to prosper financially from her marriages. Allison also engages in a theological discussion on the benefits of marriage versus celibacy. In some ways, she anticipates the arguments of the Protestant reformers, who campaigned for clerical marriage, the ability of pastors to marry. In contrast, her 5th husband, Jankin, is depicting reading famous medieval anti-marriage tracts. You can see this in lines 677, 680, and 681. However, Allison knows her Bible, though she makes some mistakes, or Chaucer does, in relating them, and the main strains of the theology of marriage. Her attitude really previews a profound shift in society that will occur several centuries in the future, where celibacy becomes the lesser virtue and marriage becomes the preferred state. The wife of Bath was ahead of her time. I'd like now to talk about the wife of Bath's tale. In its structure, this is an Arthurian romance, as in King Arthur, with similarities to its contemporary Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. In theme, the wife of Bath's tale closely resembles the Tale of Florent from John Gower's Confessio Amatis, which, like Canterbury Tales, is a collection of stories. The frame story in Confessio Amatis is that an aging lover is confessing his deeds to a priest of Venus, the goddess of love. This work was probably written between 1386 and 1390, which makes it just a tad bit older than the wife of Bath's tale. None of the tales in Confessio Amatis is original. Some are derived from Ovid's Metamorphoses, an ancient Roman work, while others may be transcriptions of oral folk tales. Chaucer and Gower knew each other and were friends. The Tale of Florent, like the wife of Bath's tale, includes a loathly lady, a common medieval trope. The loathly lady is ugly, poor, an old woman who requests a favor, a kiss, or marriage to a young man. When the man assents to the request, she then transforms into a beautiful young woman. Think of the enchantress in Beauty and the Beast, although in that case the young man did not agree to the loathly lady's demands and received a curse instead. The loathly lady is a fairy woman of some sort in these tales, but she may be an adaptation of a Gallic goddess, Calyx. Calyx literally means old woman or hag, and was considered a weather deity and closely linked with winter. The loathly lady also appears in tales of the early Irish king, Niall of the Nine Hostages. The final frame narrative on our reading list, and the most recent, if you will, is the Heptameron, written or compiled by the powerful female ruler Marguerite of Navarre in the first half of the 16th century. You can read about this interesting woman in your anthology assigned reading. Like Boccaccio's Decameron and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the framed story of the Heptameron involved a group of people telling each other stories. The storytellers are 5 men and 5 women, trapped in an abbey while they await safer traveling conditions. There are robbers about, and there's been a flood. The travelers decide to tell each other stories, 1 story per person per day. That would be 7 days, in order to pass the time. We have story 8 from day 1 here in our anthology as our assigned reading. As in Boccaccio's Decameron, each day has a master or mistress of ceremonies that decides that day's theme. The mistress of ceremonies for day 1 is Parlement, who decided that the theme would be dirty tricks played on women by men or on men by women. Therefore, each story has some morally questionable characters in it. The storyteller for story 8 on day 1 is Longarine, a character who is a young widow. She tells her listeners that she will tell a story that makes a cuckold out of the man. A cuckold is a man who has a cheating wife. But this story will preserve the honor of the woman. Thus, Longarine uses a double bed trick in order to teach the husband, who is a cheater of the first order, a lesson. The bed trick involves substitution in the dark of the romantic partner you suspect with one that you don't suspect that might have a better claim to your body. In this story, the cheating husband thinks he is making an appointment for a romantic rendezvous with his wife's serving girl. However, the serving girl tattles to her mistress, and the wife decides to take her place. Under the cover of darkness, the cheating husband doesn't realize he's actually making love to his own wife. Pleased with himself, he then tells his friend that he should have a go at the serving girl. When the friend, presumed to be her husband by the wife, is ready to go back home, he coaxes the wife's wedding ring from her as a token of affection. Not knowing that this man is not her husband, the wife eagerly gives it to him. Imagine the husband's surprise and chagrin when he sees that his cheating ways have only ended up hurting him. The bed trick may seem like sexual coercion at the very least, or downright non-consensual sex, or even rape at the other. Please understand that we are looking at this situation through our modern lens. The bed trick appears in the Bible in 2 places in Genesis. In the first, Jacob wants to marry Rachel, Laban's younger and beautiful daughter. It is not right, however, in that ancient Middle Eastern culture, for the younger daughter to marry before the older one, so Laban has Leah dress up as Rachel and marry Jacob instead. They reveal the deceit only after the wedding night has passed. We see another example in Genesis 38, where Tamar tricks Judah into sleeping with her because he will not allow her to marry his youngest son. Although we might see this kind of deception as abhorrent now, in a time where women had very little power, the bed trick affords them some kind of agency and a protection against male exploitation. By exploiting the exploiters, women can achieve a kind of justice. The bed trick trope was common in the Renaissance. It appears in 2 of Shakespeare's plays, but it's not a trope that has followed us into the modern age. I hope you enjoy these framed narratives this week. All of them feature what some might call proto-feminists, as characters in the stories, or as the storytellers themselves, or both. One of the discussion questions asks you to consider this point. Are Shahrazad, the wife of Bath and the Loathly Lady, and Longarine/Bonnet's wife feminists in our modern sense? Or are they just really good at using patriarchy to their advantage to achieve their own ends, whether it be becoming a queen who lives out a natural life, having a handsome young husband, or making sure your husband never cheats on you again? What do these framed narratives tell us about the societies that produce them? I look forward to reading your opinions on these issues and others in the discussion boards.